Thank you, Commissioner Redhead, for the nice introduction. Thank you very much. I want to share my screen. I guess the IT will give me permission to share my screen. Okay. I think it's this one. Right. So I'm going to look at the implementation of code of conduct. I'm going to look at it, across the board, not necessarily in Grenada per se, because I can't claim to be an authority in the code of conduct implementation in Grenada. So by way of introduction, I would say that the public and citizens are expected, the public and citizens expect a person in public life to work impartially, not to be influenced by personal motives, not to show favoritism, and not to misuse public resources for their personal benefits. So this means that they must always be careful not to put themselves in a position where their work responsibilities could be affected by some other interests that they have. It is equally important that they avoid circumstances where other people could reasonably consider that their personal interests create a conflict with their work responsibilities. There is always a possibility of conflict between a person in public professional and personal lives. They need to be alert to this. If such circumstances arise, they must be very open and ensure that they have properly disclosed the potential conflict, have distanced themselves from involvement, and avoided acquiring information that could be seen as giving them a personal advantage. So, Commissioner Convener, one will ask, what is conflict of interest at all? Conflict of interest involves a conflict between the public duty and private interest of a public official, in which the public official has a private capacity interest which could improperly influence the performance of their official duties and responsibilities. Conflicts of interest are not per se corruption. Okay, we should note that. Conflict of interest are not corruption per se. The private capacity interest could affect the performance of public duties, but it has not affected it yet. It becomes corruption, or it is corruption in the making. So conflict of interest exists in the gray area where public and private interests are mixed and where lines are blurred. In this area, it is easy to make a mistake. This gray area is particularly difficult to address in the traditional, particularly small island developing states for some obvious reasons. So two general strategies for effectively managing conflict of interest. There are two general strategies for strengthening public sector ethics and for effectively managing conflict of interest. The first strategy requires incorporating ethics management in the day-to-day operations of public bodies, in particular, emphasizing the responsibilities of line managers for managing the ethical performance of their subordinates. And the second strategy calls for establishing an external structure, for example, conflict of interest commission or anti-corruption body, that would oversee the ethics regime in the public administration. In both cases, administration need to introduce code of conduct, effective disciplinary procedures, and effective training system, as well as designating specialized ethics officers who will advise staff. So if we look at the Article 8 of the UNCAC, it requires that code of conduct for public officials should be adopted. And violations of the code should entail dissuasive and proportionate sanctions. Looking at conflict of interest management procedures, these codes should clearly and unambiguously state what behaviors are acceptable and which will not be tolerated, and which provide clear guidance on how to act in a situation of a conflict of interest, such as when offered a gift or hospitality. The code should clearly set out conflict of interest management procedures, ensuring that both monetary and non-monetary conflicts of interest relating to, say, political affiliations, family relations, etc., are avoided and properly managed. A key instrument for managing conflict of interest situation is the mandatory, ideally written form, disclosure of conflict to direct a supervisor or a designated official or body. Now, disclosures or signing a mandatory declaration that members are not in a situation of conflict of interest is often a requirement and part of the procedures of tender evaluation committees in some jurisdictions. Another important tool to avoid conflict of interest is the creation of a register of incompatibilities that ensures that a person cannot occupy mutually exclusive positions, for example, in the public and private sectors or in the political parties at the same time. So how do we deal with codes of breaches, code of conduct breaches? Well, the normal procedure will be submission of a complaint, either by electronically or by post or in person. Then there is investigation process. When considering any complaint, the body or the commission shall first consider if the matter is within its remit. If so, the commission or the body shall consider whether sufficient evidence has been provided to justify the initiation of an investigation into whether the code of conduct may have been breached. If the commission considers that the matter is not within its remit, it shall refer the matter to the appropriate authority. Then there's a sanction regime. If the commission finds that an official is in breach of any rules of the court, it must recommend the imposition of one or more of the following, which are not, the lists are not exhaustive. It can be a reprimand, a financial penalty specifying the amount, the return to the donor or the giver, delivering to the state or reimburse of the value of the gift, hospitality or benefit received, or the reimbursement of any unlawful gain or illicit acquisition. Can also have suspension or dismissal, etc., etc. Now, managing and resolving conflict of interest situation, disclosures are key. We have so many types of disclosures. Now, ensuring that public officials know what is required of them in relation to identifying and declaring conflict of interest situation. One, there should be what we call initial disclosure on the appointment or taking up a new position. So before appointment or taking up a new position, you have to disclose. That's what we call initial disclosure of any conflicts that you think you may have. You develop procedures that enable public officials, when they take up office, to identify and disclose relevant private interests that potentially conflict with their official duties. Now, such disclosure is usually formal by means of registration of information identifying the interest, and is required to be provided periodically, generally on commencement in office and thereafter at regular intervals, usually annually, and in writing. We also have internal or limited access disclosure. So disclosures is not necessarily required to be a public process. See, internal and limited access disclosures within the public organization, together with appropriate resolution or management of any conflict, may be sufficient to achieve the policy objectives of the process. That's encouraging public confidence in the integrity of the public official and their organization. So you can just do internal disclosure within the organization to your supervisor without any public fanfare. In general, the more senior the public official, the more likely it is that public disclosure will be appropriate. The more junior, the more likely it is that internal disclosure to the management of the official's organization will be sufficient for obvious reasons. We also have what we call the in-service disclosure in office, which makes public officials aware that they must promptly disclose all relevant information about a conflict when circumstances change after their initial disclosure has been made, or when a new situation arises resulting in an emergent conflict of interest. Now, as with a formal registration, ad hoc disclosure itself is not necessarily required to be a public process or to be made public. Internal declaration may be sufficient to encourage public confidence that integrity is being managed appropriately. Then there is a completeness and effective disclosure. See, completeness of disclosure, determining whether disclosures of interest contain sufficient detail on the conflicting interest to enable an adequately informed decision to be made about the appropriate resolution. The responsibility for adequacy of a disclosure rests with the individual public official. Then we have effective disclosure process. Ensure that organization's administrative process assists full disclosure and that the information disclosed is properly assessed and maintained in up-to-date form. It is appropriate that the responsibility for providing adequate disclosure of relevant information should rest with the individual officials. Then resolution and management options. Options for positive resolution or management of a continuing or pervasive conflict can include one or more of the several strategies appropriate. For example, you can look at divestment or separation or liquidation of the interest by the public officials. You can also look at recusal of the public official for involvement in an affected decision-making process, or restrictions of access by the affected public official to particular information. Transfer of public official duty to a non-conflicting function, or rearrangement of the public official's duty and responsibilities. Can also look at the assignment of the conflicting interests in a genuinely blind trust arrangement, or resignation of the public official from the conflict or from the conflicting private capacity functions, and or resignation of the public officials from the public office. Recusal and restrictions are quite interesting to look at, quite detailed here. Where a particular conflict is not likely to recur frequently, it may be appropriate for the public official concerned to maintain their current position, but not participate in the decision-making on the affected matters. For example, by having an affected decision made by an independent party rather than the conflicted official. By abstaining from voting on decisions, or withdrawing from discussion of affected proposals or plans, or not receiving relevant documents or other information relating to a private interest. Here, I know that there was a powerful president in the country where information are not even tried, they try to hide information from him because it's in conflict. I'm sure your guess is as good as mine. The option of assigning certain functions of public officials concerned should also be available where a particular conflict is considered likely to continue, thereby making ad hoc recusal inappropriate. Particular care must be exercised to ensure that all affected parties to the decision know of the measures taken to protect the integrity of the decision-making process where recusal is adopted. So I want to look briefly at the case of Mauritius, Independent Commission Against Corruption, ANCAC, that's what they call the anti-corruption body, Mauritius case. You see, in the ANCAC recommend codes of conduct for different stakeholders with a view to guide them towards agreed standards of conduct. Now, codes of conduct have been developed and are being implemented by officers of the public service, public officials involved in procurement, local councillors, and among others. So here, they design different codes of conduct for different target groups. Other examples of code of conduct that it has developed include the code of conduct for the employees of National Transport Corporation and the code of conduct for the Sugar Investment Trust. In Mauritius, particularly the Sugar Investment Trust is a big area for the economy. So they look at the sensitive areas where risk there will impact largely on the economy, and they target those areas and develop code of conduct for them to protect the economy of that country. Now, model codes has also been developed for adoption and adaptation by parastatal bodies or some private sectors as well. It has also developed code of conduct for members of the National Assembly. So you could see that they develop different code of conduct for different target groups. How did ANCAC implement their codes of conduct? Although the ICAC assists the stakeholders in developing, dissemination and implementation of the codes through working and training sessions, the responsibility to implement rests with the relevant stakeholders, not the anti-corruption body. For example, the code of conduct for local councillors is monitored by an ethics committee set up in different local authorities. The implementation of code of ethics for public officials is overseen by management and anti-corruption committees set up at levels of different public bodies. So what we have done in Mauritius and most of other jurisdictions is this, that I managed to get all these countries to set up anti-corruption commissions in each of the ministry, department, and agencies to able to be a watchdog within the public organization, because the anti-corruption agency, like the Integrity Commission, cannot be everywhere in all the areas. So they have these anti-corruption committees in each of the ministry, department, and agencies. And these committee members are staff of those agencies anyway. And there's no cost on the anti-corruption agency. So it is useful to note that the code of conduct also prohibits behaviors that can be regarded as criminal offense. For example, the giving and receipt of gifts for corrupt purpose, conflict of interest, the abuse of public office, among others. Trying to look at some achievement of the implementation, what factors accounted for such. There are increasing recognition for the need of code of conduct to guide officials in Mauritius, because they've seen the efficacy and the usefulness of it. This is explained by increasing number of institutions requesting the ICAC to provide assistance for the development of a code of conduct for their employees. The codes are developed together with the representatives of employees and management. And this is followed up by induction, training, working sessions to explain the different provisions and the code for compliance. In some cases, codes of conduct have been reviewed in view of changing context in order to be relevant and up to date. For example, in some cases, environmental issues have been included during the review. Also, the collaboration of management employees are important to ensure compliance to the provisions of the code. And management and employees feel part of the process, and thus compliance is easy or easier. So the process is facilitated by our awareness session and training sessions. So they talk about conflict of interest declaration form, and I just pick some few key issues in there. So first, you provide your personal details, your name, positions, etc. But the most important thing is that you declare the situation, describe the matter under consideration, in which you feel that you'll be conflicted. And then you will describe your expected role duties to be performed by the officer in dealing with this matter. Now, while having described the situation, you describe your interest, which is particularly the private interest. Do you or your relative or associates have a personal interest in this matter under consideration? Do you or your relative associate have a direct or indirect interest in the matter under consideration? So these are some key issues in the declaration form, particularly for conflict of interest declaration, so that they can take necessary action. So that is my presentation, and I'll be happy to receive comments, questions.
Dr.